under house arrest at his holiday home in the Crimea. The announcement from Moscow at 4:30 this morning carried a shocking impact across the world. Many Western leaders have been on holiday. They're urgently discussing how to respond. Moscow radio told the Soviet people that Mr. Gorbachev couldn't perform his duties for health reasons. His deputy, Vice President Yanayev, said he was taking over, backed by an emergency committee of leading hardliners, including the heads of the KGB, the police and the armed forces. They say they'll clamp down on the press and ban demonstrations, and troops have already moved on TV and radio stations. Mr. Gorbachev, who was on holiday by the Black Sea, is reported under house arrest there. But leading reformers are sticking by him, and armoured units near the Kremlin have encountered thousands of demonstrators. Our first report is from Moscow.
5 years after the perestroika revolution began, the hardline backlash feared by so many has finally taken place. Soviet army tanks in their hundreds moved onto the streets of Moscow to enforce the newly imposed state of emergency. They carried out their mission with customary efficiency, taking up key positions throughout the city. Soviet television and radio announced news of the takeover this morning, condemning the policies of Mr. Gorbachev and offering wage increases and frozen prices to win over public opinion. The state of emergency bans demonstrations, but the takeover has not gone ahead without resistance. As soon as the initial shock wore off, hundreds of protesters took to the streets, gathering just outside Red Square to denounce the coup. Tanks attempting to move into position found their path blocked by pedestrians, and on at least one occasion the soldiers inside met with violent opposition. One group of armoured vehicles parked menacingly outside the parliament of the Russian Federation as demonstrators demanded their return to barracks. Undaunted, Russia's President Boris Yeltsin used a tank as a platform. He told his people to resist what he said was a right-wing coup. The emergency decrees had no legal force on the territory of the Russian Federation. Mr. Yeltsin called for a general strike and urged the people of Moscow to come and defend the Russian parliament. As to Mikhail Gorbachev, he said there had been no firm news. He'd been on holiday in the Crimea when the hardliners made their move. Boris Yeltsin said he believed the Soviet president was being detained and must be given the chance to address the nation.
Все это заставляет нас объявить незаконным пришедший к власти так называемый комитет.
Strikes had already begun in Leningrad and some factories in the Urals. Wherever my call for a strike is heard, Mr. Yeltsin said, people back it. In an effort to stop the word of resistance from spreading, the authorities have shut down independent broadcasters, including Russian television. But as physical opposition within the capital continues, it appears the struggle for power in the Soviet Union is by no means over.
John Major described the events in Moscow as very ominous. There's an emergency cabinet meeting this afternoon, and the Prime Minister says he'll be talking to Britain's allies. He said there seemed little doubt that President Gorbachev was forcibly removed from office.
There seems little doubt that President Gorbachev has been removed from power by an unconstitutional seizure of power. There are constitutional ways of removing the President of the Soviet Union. They have not been used. Whatever the future may hold for President Gorbachev, I hope there is no doubt in anyone's mind about the immense contribution that he's made over recent years, both to the prospects for people within the Soviet Union and for the rapprochement that has taken place between East and West as a result of his efforts and those of Presidents Reagan, Bush and others. He has therefore a very proud record indeed. I believe that the whole world has a very serious stake in the events currently taking place in the Soviet Union. The reform process there is of vital importance to the whole world, and of most vital importance, of course, to the Soviet people themselves, and I hope that is fully understood by everyone. There is a great deal of information we don't yet have, but I would like to make clear, above all, that we will expect the Soviet Union to respect and honour all those commitments that President Gorbachev has made on its behalf. I hope we will be able to say more later on today. I will take one or two questions, but very few.
John Harrison. Prime Minister, given what you say, do you believe it's too late now to influence events? And if it is, who does the West do business with?
Well, we simply don't know the answer to that question yet. I hope we'll find out more information during the course of the day.
Prime Minister, the G7 summit offered moral support to Mr. Gorbachev. Do you now feel in retrospect that you should have given him more, much more, and by especially hard cash?
No, I don't believe that is the case, and neither is that the cause of the present difficulties in the Soviet Union today, so far as we can see. What we were seeking to do, and indeed I was going to Moscow in order to further that later on this year, what we were seeking to do was to help along the reform process. What appears to have happened is a strike against the reform process in the Soviet Union.
The President of Lithuania, President Vytautas Landsbergis, says he fears the new rulers of the Soviet Union will set up a military dictatorship. He appealed for international help to resist any crackdown in the Baltic states. The level of support that the new government may receive from the leaders of the armed forces is crucial to the takeover. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Ben Brown reports.
One of the most critical questions facing those who've mounted this coup is whether they really can count on the support of the army if and when the new leadership's authority is challenged. The army's officers are divided. Some of them are hardliners, some in favour of radical reform. Most of the ordinary troops are unwilling conscripts rather than professional soldiers. And the generals can only rely absolutely on 6 airborne divisions. But even under Gorbachev, Soviet troops have shown themselves to be perfectly capable of killing large numbers of civilians. In Lithuania, for example, in Georgia and in Azerbaijan. Yet their resources and their motivation may be stretched too far if there are now simultaneous uprisings in several of the 15 republics. Between them, the 4 men who seem to be the driving force behind this coup are also 4 of the most powerful men in the country. Quite possibly, they've been plotting this takeover for months, even years. Dmitry Yazov, the defense minister, who was promoted under Gorbachev, is perhaps the most significant member of the committee that's now taken power. He's in control of the army. Vladimir Krychkov is head of the KGB, with as many as 750,000 staff at his command. Boris Pugo, a hardliner, recently appointed Interior Minister, has control of the police and Special Interior Ministry troops, while Valentin Pavlov, the Prime Minister, is supposed to be in charge of the economy, although he's never looked very happy trying to implement Gorbachev's reforms.
Well, they include the Prime Minister, the head of the KGB and the head of the Defence Forces. So, yes, I think we have to say they have the forces of coercion in their hands. The army may not be unified, but nevertheless it's a very powerful force and can be used, I think, certainly the specialist units in operations of this kind. On the other hand, this will spark off tremendous resistance in parts of the Soviet Union, and I'm bound to say this is certain to lead, it seems to me, to violence and bloodshed.
For the orthodox communists of the Soyuz group, which has been consistently campaigning against Gorbachev, today's events will look like a godsend. The hardliners have chosen this moment to strike, paradoxically because Gorbachev was enjoying some success. Tomorrow, 5 of the republics, including Russia, were to have signed his new Union Treaty, designed to be the basis of a freer Soviet Union. 4 more republics, including the Ukraine, were due to sign it later, while the 6 remaining republics, including the Baltics, have refused all along to have anything to do with the treaty. It's these republics, and especially Lithuania, who are now most fearful and appealing to the world for help.
Appeal to the nations of the world and the governments of 3 states, and to the United Nations Organization and other international organizations. Render rightful aid to the government of Lithuania, which has been legitimately elected by the people. Do not allow the tragedy of Budapest and Prague to repeat itself.
But what's probably worrying the leaders of the coup is that Soviet workers may protest against the takeover with a prolonged general strike, which could prove to be as great a challenge to them as public protests on the streets.
Well, with me now is Britain's former ambassador to Moscow, Sir Brian Cartledge. Sir Brian, we've been warned again and again that Gorbachev was vulnerable. Was the coup, the manner and the timing of it so much of a surprise?
I think the timing was a surprise in the sense that Gorbachev had just had a conspicuously successful plenary session of the Central Committee of the Communist Party just last month, where everything went his way much more easily than people had expected. But at the same time, I think perhaps we underestimated the degree of opposition to the new Union Treaty, which was due to be signed tomorrow. And I think that that impending signature was probably the catalyst which led the Conservatives to take their action now.